Hello everyone, welcome to Desker's YouTube channel. In this video, we'll be having fun with user stories, and along the way, hopefully we'll learn how to actually write a good user story. User stories are small pieces of a large puzzle, just like this 1000-piece Naruto puzzle featured above. It took me and my wife almost 6 months to complete it. Now that's a completely different user story that we'll not be discussing in this video. But in the end, we had to go to the eye doctor and get our eyes checked. User stories are an integral part of the software development process. If you work in product management, design or development, you will be working with user stories a lot. They'll become a constant companion. So you want to build a product or a feature. Do you just start writing user stories with your idea? No. You have to go through the entire process of discovery, talk to customers until you finally figure out what you want to build. You also have to do the prioritization exercise. So for this video, we'll just assume that you've already done all the good stuff and you now are in a position where you want to implement your idea through a set of user stories. What we'll focus in this video on is, first, why do we need a user story? Who is it for? Who uses user stories? Who writes them? Key elements of user stories. Then we'll dive deeper into the actual gist of user stories. We'll talk about user story mapping. We'll look at an example. We'll then look at feature hierarchy. And then we'll end up with the user story template that we'll end up using day to day in your daily work, and look at also the invest framework so that you can do a sanity check on your user stories before sending it to the development team. So why do we need a user story? It's a good question. Why can't we just start building out a software without a user story? Well, you can try it, but you won't necessarily end up anywhere. You'll have too many questions by the end of the day. You'll get super confused and you'll just give up. What a user story helps you do is it helps you take these small concrete steps to achieve the vision that you have for your product. It does it by helping you, one, focus on what is important, agree on the scope of the product, prioritize the order of development, align the different teams to achieve the common goal, estimate the effort required to completing the feature, track how close you are to completing your product goals, collaborate with cross-functional teams on what it would take to complete the story, and finally, fit all the moving parts of the puzzle together. You start with what's most important and then move up and build layers of feature and functionality that enhance the user experience and brings value to them. Who uses a user story? Product managers. It enables product managers to translate their thoughts into a living document. It's important for them because it enables them to get feedback on what they think needs to happen and communicate the final expectations with the team. Developers and QAs use a user story as the single source of truth. If they have any questions about how things should work, they eventually go back to the user story. If they still have some questions or concerns, then they go and talk to the product manager. Engineering managers use user stories to estimate and track project based on the resources they have available, and designers use user stories to build out how the user will interact with the product. Who writes the user stories? Well, you think this would be an easy one to answer, but actually it's not. You think it's product managers? But a lot of companies don't have product managers. What? Yes, that is the reality of the day. You might end up working in companies that don't have product managers and you'll have to deal with it. So, what I've seen user stories being written by product managers, business analysts, software architects, engineering managers, developers, CEOs, co-founders. I'm not a big fan of titles, so instead of focusing on who this title is that is writing the user story, let's focus on the skills that a person needs to have in order to write these user stories. One, empathy for users. If you don't understand the challenges that users are going through, you will not be able to write a user story. in-depth understanding of the user's needs, grasp on the product vision and strategy of the company, understanding the needs of the business, understanding the competitive landscape, working knowledge of the existing product and all the relevant features. In most cases, this is basically the job description for a product manager opening. Now let's look at the 4 key elements of a user story. Number 1 is user driven. Each user story is driven by a user's need. A particular type of users is always the focus of every user story. The completion of the user story helps the user in some way. It could be big or small, directly or indirectly. If you ever come across a user story that you can't relate to a user, then make sure to highlight that with the team. Something needs to change. A user doesn't necessarily need to be the end user of your external product. It can be one of your internal stakeholders who are using some internal products. Number 2, outcome. As discussed above, each user story has a purpose. At the completion of the user story, that purpose should be fulfilled. If the user story does not achieve the desired outcome, then it needs to be reworked. This can happen if performing the action described in the user story actually does not give you the desired result. Number 3, acceptance criteria. Achieving the desired outcome is just one part of your user story, right? There are lots of different ways. There are millions of ways in which you can get to the desired outcome. But there is only one way that it is acceptable to the team, because that is the way the team thinks is the right way for the users. That forms your acceptance criteria and is documented as a part of the user story. Number 4, definition of done. I can't tell you how many meetings I've sat in at the end of the sprints where there's confusion about the definition of done. Everybody has a different answer for what done means. Some people say, hey, done means the developer has completed the story. Somebody else will say the QA has tested the story. Somebody else will say the designer has reviewed the story, which means it's done. Or somebody else will say, hey, no, the regression has to be complete before you say the story is done. So please try to avoid this confusion. It is important that we are all clear about what done means. A common definition of done that has worked for me is the product manager has tested the user story along with the developer, QA, and designer. The user story passes all the acceptance criteria. It satisfies both functional and design requirements. Number 5, open and subject to change. One of the goals of writing a user story is because you want to make sure everybody is clear on the definition of done. But things might change. That might lead to the change in scope of the user story. Some examples are, you go to the grooming meeting and the dev team finds out after doing their spies that the user story, it's not possible, it's not technically feasible to do. So you might have to change the scope. You might have to rewrite your user story. They might feel that the current implementation will actually take a lot of time, or the needs of the business has changed. So make sure that you're okay and you're flexible about the fact that user stories might change. Even though you are okay with user stories changing, make sure there's a valid reason to change it, just like the ones we discussed above. And you're not changing the user story at the whim and fancy of anyone and everyone, because that will only lead to chaos. Alright, now comes the fun stuff, user story mapping. I really enjoy this exercise. It's one of the methods used by product teams to find ways to solve problems faced by users. You start with a blank canvas or board and map out the journey for the users through your product or service, key actions and interactions they have, challenges, bottlenecks that they face, things that are nice to have, must have, could have, should have. You do this exercise before launching a new product, as well as at regular intervals after the initial release. It helps you keep the user's need front and center as the product grows and becomes more complicated. Who do you invite to a user story session? Well, the short answer is anybody who can help improve the product. But you can't invite the entire company to this exercise. That's just not feasible. But what you can make sure is that there is representation from different teams like sales, customer success support, pre-sales, design and development. You'll discuss how to actually organize and run a user story mapping session in a separate video. For now, we're just going to assume that you've done your user story mapping exercise and you have something up on the board, and we're going to look at an example of it right now. So for the purpose of understanding user story mapping, let's forget about technology for a minute. What if I asked you to draw a user story map for buying a shirt the old school way? You might ask, what is the old school way? It is the way in which you drive to a store, you walk to an aisle and buy a shirt. What? Who does that? Well, my dad still does that. I'm sure your dad too. But the reason we're doing this is because we're so used to technology, and if I go through this example with an actual online experience, we'll just use your experience with these products to just write down the user story map, which kind of defeats the purpose, because you'll be focusing on all the features you have seen in your experience. So bear with me for some time, and let's try to go to a store to buy a t-shirt. So think about it for a minute. What are some of the steps that come to your mind if you had to go to the store? First, I guess I would try and find a store that sells shirts. Then I'd go to the store, pick up a shirt and then pay for it. Well, yeah, sounds fairly high level, but I think it's good. Now some questions come to mind. Do the users have car? Do they use public transport? What type of shirt do they want? Do they have a price range? Any particular brands they like? Can they go to the store anytime? How much do they want to pay? Well, yeah, there's so many questions, right? And there's a barrage of questions that we can throw at you. What would really help is if we knew who was going to buy the shirt, understand the user, what the needs and wants are, what are the challenges they face. In short, wouldn't it be great if we had an in-depth understanding of the target user persona? That would really make our life easier, wouldn't it? Well, let's assume for the purpose of this exercise that you've done all that and you've been able to make informed decisions, and you have a user story map in front of you that looks something like this. And again, we're assuming that you worked with all your sales, customer success, all your stakeholders, and after discussing with them, this is something that all of you agree on. Now let's look at the user journey map. What you see is you see 3 levels in 3 different colors, blue, green and yellow. At the very top is the goal of your exercise or for the user. The user wants to go to the store and buy a shirt. The next level in green are the 3 key things that they do in order to make or achieve the goal. They go to the store, they find the t-shirt and they make the payment. The third level is the one in yellow, where you're further breaking down those actions into smaller bits. For example, if you talk about finding the shirt, there can be smaller actions that lead to the user finding the shirt. You have to locate the aisle, you have to look through options, you have to select the shirt you like, try them out and pick out a winner. Now, like we said, right at the top in blue is what you'd call your goal or a theme. In green is the level 2, which is generally your epic, and everything that you see in yellow are user stories. So this is how you will organize your user story or your project or your goal inside of Jira or any other software that you use. On the very top would be a goal or a theme of buying the shirt. Then you will create different epics, and below those epics you will create all these different user stories. In this video, we'll take up one of those user stories and try to use the user story template to come up with the acceptance criteria for that particular user story. Before we do that, let's quickly look at or talk about very briefly about feature hierarchy. We've already had a longer discussion in a separate video about this. Do check it out. In feature hierarchy, you will have your epic, then you'll have your user stories, and those user stories will be broken down into smaller tasks for the dev team to be able to go over, or even subtasks if they want that level of detail. Now we'll talk about the user story template, and then we will apply that template to an actual example from the user story map that we have created. A user story consists of 4 parts. One is the user, the second is the action, the third is the result, and the fourth is the acceptance criteria. How it goes is, as a user, I want to be able to perform an action so that I can get an XYZ result. And then you list out all the acceptance criteria, which is the boundary within which your solution needs to work. Okay, so how would you apply this user story template to an actual story? So let's pick up the user story from the epic about finding the shirt and build the user story about locating the shirt aisle. This is how I would develop the story. As a user, I want to be able to find the shirt aisle of the store where shirts are kept. See, this is the action that you want to take, so that I can choose the one that I want to take, which is the result. The acceptance criteria of this could look like, number 1, the search section should be marked clearly so that the user can find it. It should have a banner 10 by 2 feet on both sides of the aisle that are easily visible to the user from a distance. Arrows on the floor should point the user to various aisles. Store associates should be trained to help users find the aisle. I hope this exercise hasn't left all of you super confused. That wasn't the goal, I picked up a non-tech example for a reason, because I want you to focus on user story, thinking through the different steps or the journey of the user instead of focusing on the technology or the execution part of it, or getting biased with what you would generally see across all the different websites that you browse to buy t-shirts for yourself, because you would intuitively know what to do, right? So I do have a fun exercise for you. What if you think about it from a different angle? What if you had to do the same exercise for an online website? What do you think is the equivalent of this user story in an online storefront? What does finding the aisle mean? Take a second, think about it for a minute. I'll wait. 1, 2. Sorry guys, I can't wait more. I'm very impatient. So what comes to mind? Search bar, filter types. Yes, you can now see, websites with search bars and filters coming in front of you. Well, it could actually be either. It depends on what the overall UX strategy of the company is, what the goal of the company is. Is it to help users find things really, really fast as possible, or is it to get users to have an immersive experience and discover things as they browse? The same actually applies to brick and mortars too, but I guess it's easier to relate to online websites these days than it is to brick and mortar stores. Okay, now that you've written down a user story, you feel really happy about it. There's one thing I would advise you to do. Use the INVEST framework, because one of the biggest challenges I faced early on in my career while writing user story was to figure out where it actually started and where it ended. Yeah, that is true guys, it gets super confusing. Whether one user story that you've written is actually 2 user stories. And does it matter? In these situations, look at the INVEST framework and do a sanity check on your user story. INVEST stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. Let's look at all the different parts. Independent means the user story should be complete within itself. You should be able to perform actions in the story by themselves. Negotiable. Software development can be confusing. We've talked about this before. On one hand, you want to provide clarity and consistency to the team, but you want to be flexible about the business needs or the other technical challenges you guys face. So what you have come up with the user story here, when you take it to the team, it's negotiable, right? The scope of it, the acceptance criteria, everything can change. Everything is on the table for discussion with the team. It has to be valuable. It has to have a positive impact on the user and the business. It could be time saving, ease of use, solving a problem, improving the user experience, reducing just something. There should be a value to the user directly or indirectly and to the company as well. A user is generally part of a user story is generally part of a theme that relates to a larger goal for the organization. The user story should be estimable, because the dev team should be able to look at it and tell you how much effort it will take for them to deliver it. Sometime this might not happen the first time you show them the user story. They might ask for spikes. Spikes are small, time-boxed tasks that development teams undertakes to figure out the technical implementation of user stories. Now, if your user story has incomplete information, or you leave something to interpretation, you will not be able to get a fair estimate. So in this case, the user story is considered incomplete and you need to rework the user story as a product manager. This does not mean that as a product manager you will have all the answers the first time you take the user story to the team. The user story that you write and you discuss with the dev team is the starting point. It is actually the beginning of creating a complete user story. Lots of things will change. Questions will come that you'll have to go and find answers for. Feedback you will get, which you'll have to then work into the user story. So based on the discussion, you'll update the user story to its final form, which will then be used by the team. Small. We've talked about this a lot. User story should be really, really small. It makes it easier to track, test, and manage them. It also mitigates the risk in case things need to change. So whenever you write a user story, ask yourself, can I break it down further while adhering to the rest of the INVEST framework? Testable. Once you complete the user story, it should be testable by the team either in its entirety or through use cases that can validate it to the extent possible. You can test whether the feature works as expected, and whether it has the impact can only be validated when it goes out in the market. So that's basically the gist of the INVEST framework. I have personally used it millions of times and it has been very helpful for me when doing those check on the user story. It helps me get a little less confused. So I hope this video has helped you, and you'll be able to write user stories a little bit better after this. If there is anything else that you'd like us to discuss or we've missed or you'd like us to cover in our future videos, do let us know. In the meantime, please subscribe to our channel on the way out. Thank you.